Story 1. Road trips always have this strange rhythm, like the world shrinks and expands with every mile you cover. The open highway can feel endless one second and then suddenly close in on you the next, like you've been dropped into some pocket universe where the rules are a little bit off. That's what it felt like for me back in the early 2000s, right after I got out of the military. I thought I knew long drives and isolation pretty well, but nothing prepared me for what happened on that trip. I had just driven from Louisiana back to my hometown in Montana. The trip went fine, no weird breakdowns, no trouble, just long hours and bad gas station coffee. After a couple of days at home, I packed back up because the plan was to settle in Boise, Idaho. This was February, and if you've ever dealt with Montana or Idaho winters, you'll understand why I didn't want to deal with the mountain roads straight down the middle of the state. Those stretches are twisting and narrow, and snow and ice turn them into death traps. So instead of tempting fate, I cut across the Idaho panhandle and planned to dip into Washington before looping back down toward Boise. Crossing into Washington, it was early. So early it felt like night hadn't fully ended yet. The fog was thick and heavy, the kind that doesn't sit still but shifts around in patches so that one minute you can see fine and the next your headlights just bounce right back at you. It made the whole stretch of highway feel eerily quiet. I'd been holding it in for a while, trying to find a decent spot to stop and take a leak, but the fog spooked me. Normally, I wouldn't have cared. I've relieved myself plenty of times on the side of a road, but something about not being able to see more than a dozen feet out felt wrong. Like if I stepped out into that gray nothingness, something unseen might be standing just past where my lights ended. I figured I could wait for a town, and not too long after, signs started popping up for one. The name escapes me now, but I remember it being something like Linden or Linder, something close to that. I followed the exit, took a short road off the highway, and sure enough, there it was. A small town, tucked away like so many others out west. Nothing unusual about it on first glance, except the closer I got, the more off it seemed. The first thing I noticed was the silence. I grew up in a rural town, so I know what quiet sounds like. But this was different. No dogs barking, no birds calling, no engines revving up, not even the distant sound of a semi on the main road. Just dead air. I thought maybe it was just because of how early it was. After all, it was Sunday morning. But even then, you'd expect some sign of life. The streets had cars parked along them, but none moving. A few businesses had their lights on, but they looked empty. I pulled up to a gas station that doubled as a service garage, one of those old school kinds with big bay doors and a small convenience area. No one was inside. The counter was empty, shelves stocked, lights humming overhead, but not a soul in sight. I walked around the side of the building, thinking maybe the bathroom was outside. The door was locked, and when I circled back, that's when I noticed something that made my stomach knot. Out in the middle of the street, not 50 yards from where I stood, was a delivery truck, a Coke truck. Its headlights were still on, hazard lights blinking, both driver and passenger doors hanging wide open. It wasn't parked at a dock or near a business. It was just there, abandoned in the road like someone had stopped suddenly, opened both doors and gotten out in a hurry. I froze, staring at it, waiting for some kind of movement. A driver to step out from between buildings, a worker walking up the sidewalk, but nothing. The whole place just felt suspended. That's when the fear really hit me. Not the kind where you think something is going to jump out at you, but the kind where your brain suddenly screams that you shouldn't be there, that you've stepped into the wrong place. I didn't bother with the bathroom anymore. I got back in my car and retraced my path out of that town as quickly as I could without speeding. When I got back on I-90, I thought about pulling over to finally relieve myself, but the thought of standing vulnerable on the shoulder of that foggy highway made my skin crawl. It was like the stillness of that town had followed me, clinging to my car. By the time I hit Spokane, the fear had dulled, replaced by confusion. I pulled out my Rand McNally Atlas, no smartphones back then, and tried to find the town. I couldn't. I looked along that stretch over and over, but there was no Linden or Linder marked anywhere near where I had been. I brushed it off as maybe a misremembered name or some unincorporated dot on the map that didn't make it into the book. But even years later, when I tried to look it up online, nothing matched. I didn't see monsters. I didn't hear voices. No shadowy figure chased me out of town. But that made it worse. The silence, the empty streets, the truck left sitting in the middle of the road with its doors hanging open. It all screamed that something had happened there, and whatever it wasn't normal. My logical side keeps telling me there has to be an explanation. Maybe it was a small farming town where everyone was at church early. Maybe the gas station guy had just stepped away. Maybe the Coke truck had broken down and the driver had gone for help. That all sounds reasonable, but the feeling I had in that moment wasn't reasonable. It's been almost 2 decades since that drive, and I can still picture it. The fog rolling in and out, the glow of the hazard lights blinking in an otherwise motionless street, the way the hairs on the back of my neck stood up, as if something was standing right behind me, watching, waiting for me to notice it. I don't think I'll ever forget that. And here's the kicker. When I finally made it to Boise, I told a friend about it. He laughed and said it sounded like I'd ripped the story straight out of Silent Hill or Resident Evil. I get why he thought that because, honestly, it felt the same way to me. But I know what I saw, and I know how it felt. There's nothing scarier than a place that looks like the real world but feels like it doesn't belong in it. That town, whatever its name was, fit that description perfectly. And if it really does exist, somewhere on that stretch of I-90 between Coeur d'Alene and Spokane, I don't think I'd ever want to see it again. Story 2. Sometimes the strangest places are the ones nobody uses anymore. Empty buildings rot in silence, and when you step inside, it feels like time has been paused for years, waiting for someone dumb enough to press play again. That's exactly the kind of feeling I got the night I went exploring an abandoned church on the edge of town. I'd driven by the place a dozen times, always thinking about how eerie it looked with its broken windows and leaning steeple. From the outside, the roof sagged like it was too tired to keep standing, and weeds had crawled so high they nearly swallowed the side doors. Everyone I knew said the church had been condemned decades ago after a storm wrecked part of the roof, but no one ever bothered to knock it down. I figured it would be just another dead building to poke around in. Inside, the air was heavier than I expected. Dust wasn't floating so much as clinging, like the place had been sealed too tight. The faint smell of rot drifted up from the wooden floorboards, mixed with mildew from somewhere deep in the walls. I remember shining my flashlight across the pews, most of them cracked and bent. Pieces of hymn books were scattered like confetti, their pages eaten by mold. Every sound echoed longer than it should have, which meant even the shuffle of my boots came back at me 3 or 4 times before dying out. When I reached what must have been the pulpit area, my light landed on something strange. In the middle of the warped floorboards was a circular pattern, almost like a stage had been built there long ago. The wood was darker in the middle, as if years of something had stained it. At first I thought it was just water damage, until I got closer and saw it wasn't old at all. Right there in the center of the circle was fresh blood. It wasn't just a drop or two either. It was enough to pool, dark and sticky, glinting wet against the beam of my flashlight. The sight made me freeze. I've gutted fish, seen hunting kills, even dealt with small injuries bad enough to bleed a lot. But this was different. It wasn't splattered randomly. It was placed right in the middle of that strange, round pattern, like something had been killed there on purpose. My brain wanted to come up with some excuse. Maybe kids sneaking in, maybe some kind of animal sacrifice for shock value. But none of those ideas made me feel better. I told myself to move on, so I left the pulpit and found a set of stairs leading down to the basement. The steps groaned like they might break, but I went anyway. The basement was a mess of old folding chairs and tables, the kind you'd see in a church dining hall. Rusted kitchen appliances sat against the wall, their cords chewed through. The smell down there was worse, damp earth mixed with iron, and I couldn't stop thinking about that blood upstairs. As I pushed deeper into the basement, the temperature dropped. It wasn't the kind of cold you feel on your skin. It was bone cold, like the air itself was drained of warmth. My flashlight flickered, just once, but it was enough to make me realize how dark it would be without it. That's when I heard it. Above me on the first floor came the sound of footsteps. Heavy ones. Someone was running, quick and sharp, across the floor directly overhead. The sound hit so suddenly, I thought maybe the building was collapsing. My first instinct was that it had to be another person. But the problem was I hadn't seen or heard anyone when I came in. There was only one set of doors, and they were still shut when I checked earlier. The running didn't fade away either. It circled overhead, fast, like whoever it was looping around the pulpit. The boards groaned and popped under the weight, and each time it passed directly above me, the ceiling dust rained down. I stood frozen with my light shaking in my hand, waiting for the sound to stop, but it just kept going. I thought maybe I should shout out, maybe scare off whoever it was, but something in me said to stay quiet. Instead, I backed slowly toward the basement stairs. The running stopped as suddenly as it started, dead quiet, like someone had been yanked out of existence mid-stride. That silence felt worse than the noise. I climbed the stairs one at a time, keeping the light ahead of me, trying to catch a glimpse of whoever was there. When I reached the top, the pulpit area was empty. The circle was still there, the blood still wet, but the entire church was silent as a tomb. I scanned the pews, the windows, the broken door frames, but nothing moved. The air seemed thicker than before, and the longer I stayed, the more it felt like the walls were leaning closer. My body went into autopilot, and I just left. I didn't check for prints in the blood or even glance behind me. I made my way straight out the doors, through the weeds, and into the night air. Even when I got back to my car, I sat there gripping the steering wheel, convinced I'd hear those running footsteps come pounding up behind me. But nothing happened. The church sat in the dark like it had never woken up at all. To this day, I still wonder about it. Maybe it was squatters. Maybe an animal somehow got in and panicked on the floorboards. But the blood being fresh and centered like that, and those footsteps circling above me in perfect loops, it didn't feel human. It didn't feel natural. I've done plenty of dumb things since then, but I've never gone back inside that church. Story 3. It's strange how silence in the woods can feel heavier than noise. Most people think of nature as peaceful, but when you're alone in the hills of West Virginia, far enough out that you can't hear a single engine or see a single porch light, that silence starts to feel like it's pressing down on you. It's the kind that makes you notice every step, every breath, like you're trespassing on ground that doesn't belong to people anymore. That's the kind of night it was when I found something I still can't explain, no matter how many times I try to reason it out. I used to do a lot of solo hiking back then. I'd follow old mining trails, cut through hunting paths, and sometimes just wander. That day I had gone farther than usual, past the ridges I normally stuck to, deeper into the hills where the forest thickens and the ground gets muddy. The air had that damp, earthy smell like rain was coming, and the canopy above was so dense it made it feel later than it was. I remember the first thing that caught my attention was the smell. Not the kind of sweet rot you get from old leaves or a fallen tree, but that iron tang that hits the back of your throat. Blood. If you've ever gutted an animal, you know the smell. It's sharp, metallic, unmistakable. I slowed down, trying to figure out where it was coming from. My first thought was maybe a hunter had made a kill and just left the remains out. That wouldn't have been unusual. I didn't have to walk far before I saw it. A deer lying on its side in a patch of flattened grass. Its body was torn, but not in a way I've ever seen. It wasn't like something had mauled it from the front or taken bites out of it. It was stripped down, neat in a way that didn't look natural. The deer was mutilated, eyes wide, legs stiff, as if it had just dropped there. At first I figured coyotes. They'll take down a deer if they're desperate enough. But when I crouched down to look closer, I noticed something strange. The meat wasn't shredded like you'd expect with teeth tearing into it. It was smooth, too smooth, like the cuts were clean instead of ragged. I backed off, my nerves buzzing, but I tried to talk myself down. Maybe I was overthinking it. But then, not even 20 feet away, I saw the coyote. Dead too. Same thing. Its teeth were bared, its eyes cloudy, like it had been caught mid-snarl. That was when the first real chill went through me, because now it wasn't just a predator killing prey. Whatever had taken down the deer had also done the same thing to a predator. I stood there longer than I should have, staring, trying to piece together how that made sense. Maybe the coyote had gone after the deer. and then something else had gone after the coyote. That seemed logical enough. But then I noticed the fox. A little farther up the rise, maybe another 10 or 15 feet. Same deal. 3 animals, all within a short stretch, all picked apart in the same bizarre way. By then, the woods didn't feel quiet anymore. They felt empty, like everything living had already decided to leave, and I was the only idiot still standing there. I looked around for tracks, for signs of people, for anything. The ground was soft enough that it should have shown paw prints, boot prints, hell, even drag marks. But there was nothing. No signs of a struggle, no trails leading in or out. Just those 3 bodies laid out like some kind of pattern. I don't spook easily, but my gut was screaming that I wasn't supposed to be there. Every branch snap sounded too sharp, every shadow too long. I couldn't shake the feeling that if I kept looking, I'd find another animal, then another, all in the same condition, stretching out deeper into the trees like a breadcrumb trail. And the worst part was the thought I couldn't push away. What if whatever had done this wasn't done yet? I remember standing there trying to convince myself to leave, but curiosity held me like a hook in the chest. My brain kept scrambling for an explanation. Disease? No, it was too clean for that. A person? Maybe some psycho. But how the hell would they move 3 different animals without leaving tracks? Some kind of big cat? We don't really get them there, and even if we did, they don't kill like that. Eventually, I forced myself to back away, retracing my steps as carefully as I could. I didn't run. I was too afraid that if I did, something would chase. But I didn't turn my back on those bodies until the trees thickened enough to block them from view. The whole walk back out, I kept expecting to hear something following me. Every gust of wind through the branches sounded like footsteps. Every rustle in the underbrush made my chest tighten. When I finally broke out of the tree line and saw my car parked on the gravel pull-off, I felt this rush of relief so strong, it almost made me laugh. I climbed in, locked the doors, and just sat there for a few minutes, breathing hard and staring back at the dark wall of trees. Nothing followed me out. No eyes glowing in the shadows, no shapes moving between the trunks. Just silence. I didn't tell anyone about it right away. It sounded too bizarre, like I was making it up. When I finally did mention it to a buddy who hunts, he shrugged and said, maybe it was just coyotes being coyotes, eating what they wanted and leaving the rest. But he couldn't explain the fox, or why there weren't any tracks, or why it looked so precise. Another friend suggested maybe poachers had set out bait, and something had gone wrong. Again, no tracks, no sign of people, nothing that made sense. It's been years and I still don't have an answer. Every once in a while, I think about going back to that ridge, just to see if I missed something. But honestly, I know I won't. There's something about the way those animals were laid out, the way the forest felt so hollow and wrong, that tells me I don't need to see it again. Some things you stumble across in the woods aren't meant to be explained. They're just warnings, reminders that out there, we're not at the top of the food chain like we like to think. Story 4. Nights in the mountains feel different than nights anywhere else. The darkness settles heavier, the silence feels thicker, and even the smallest sound carries like it's happening just a few feet away. I had gone camping by myself that weekend. Just me, a tent, and a small fire pit set up off an old trail that didn't look like many people used. It wasn't my first solo trip, and I usually love the quiet, but there's a point in the night when quiet turns into something else, something that makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up. That night I had gone to sleep early. The air was crisp, and the wind rustled through the pine trees like faint whispers. Sometime after midnight, I woke up with that sudden urge to piss. I didn't want to crawl out of my warm sleeping bag, but nature doesn't wait. I grabbed my headlamp, slipped my boots on, and stepped out into the cold. My fire had burned out hours ago, leaving just blackened logs and faint wisps of smoke. The forest around me looked endless, swallowed up in shadows, and the beam of my headlamp cut only a small tunnel through it. I didn't want to piss too close to my tent, so I walked maybe 20 or 30 feet into the trees. The ground was soft with pine needles, and every step sounded muffled. I stopped near a fallen log, unzipped, and that's when I heard it. Rocks shifting behind me. Not a single crunch like something dropping, but several small scrapes, like weight pressing onto loose stone. My body tensed up immediately. I told myself it was probably a deer or maybe a raccoon, something small moving through the brush. But the sound wasn't just one or two movements. It was steady, deliberate, like footsteps. I kept my eyes locked straight ahead, pretending I hadn't heard it. My stomach dropped when the noise stopped completely, leaving only the sound of my own breathing. I finished quickly, zipped up, and turned my head slowly, raising my light toward the direction of the sound. That's when I saw them. Eyes, dozens of them. At first, I thought maybe it was a trick of the light. But no, there were at least 20 distinct reflections glowing back at me from the trees. The beam of my headlamp caught them one by one, and they didn't move. They just stared. They were spread out in a half circle, almost surrounding me, all at the same height off the ground. That detail sent my brain into overdrive. Too high to be raccoons, too many to be deer, and they weren't blinking, not once. I froze. My breathing hitched, and my chest locked up like I was holding my breath without meaning to. I tried to think logically. Maybe elk, maybe some pack of coyotes. Though coyotes' eyes sit lower, don't they? But the longer I stared, the less animal it felt. They weren't making noise anymore. No shuffling, no snorts, nothing. Just dead silence and those unmoving eyes shining like tiny mirrors. The woods have a way of making you feel small, but in that moment, I felt like prey. Every instinct screamed at me not to move, like if I took a step, they'd close in. I don't know how long I stood there. Seconds, maybe minutes. But eventually I forced myself to back away slowly. I kept my light aimed at them, and every time I moved a step, I waited to see if they would too. But they didn't. They stayed frozen, watching. When I finally got close enough to see my tent again through the trees, I broke into a full sprint. I dove inside, zipped it up fast, and pressed my back against the fabric like that thin layer of nylon was actually protection. My heart pounded so hard I thought I'd pass out. I turned my headlamp off, not wanting to draw attention, and sat in the dark, straining my ears for any sound. For the rest of the night, I heard nothing. No footsteps, no breathing, no animal calls. Just silence so heavy it almost rang in my ears. At some point, exhaustion won out and I dozed off, but it was the most restless sleep I've ever had. The next morning, I crawled out to find the forest looking completely normal. The log where I'd stopped was just a log. The rocks were undisturbed, no prints in the dirt, nothing to explain what I saw. Part of me wanted to write it off as deer or elk, something natural that I'd exaggerated in my half-asleep state, but I keep coming back to how the eyes didn't move. Animals shift, twitch, blink, anything. These didn't. They stayed fixed, locked on me like they were waiting. Even now, I go back and forth in my head. If it were animals, why didn't they make a sound after I turned? If it wasn't, then what the hell was standing out there in the trees, watching me? Story 5. There are certain places you stumble across when you're young that just never leave your mind. For me, it was an old structure down by the river that my teenage curiosity wouldn't let me ignore. I was around 15, full of that reckless confidence you only have when you're still half a kid, but trying to prove you're not afraid of anything. The building was an eyesore, 3 stories high, leaning slightly like a tired man who's had one too many drinks. Most of its windows were gone, leaving empty sockets that made it look more like a skull than anything meant for people. It didn't look safe, but the danger was half the point. The first time I went, I was alone. My friends had talked about it before, about climbing it, about how sketchy it looked, but no one actually followed through. Something about it pulled at me, though. It sat there like a dare against the skyline, right on the edge of the water, as if waiting for someone stupid enough to step inside. I figured if I didn't do it now, I'd never stop thinking about it. Getting inside wasn't simple. The front was sealed off, but the side had this collapsed section where bricks had crumbled into a pile. I had to use the rubble-like steps to pull myself through a busted opening. Inside, it smelled like mold and river water, damp and sour, with the faint trace of burnt wood. There were no stairs at first, just big holes in the floor where wooden planks had rotted away. I climbed, gripping the edges of what was left of the staircase. Each step groaned like it was threatening to give out, but it somehow held. By the time I reached the second floor, the air felt heavier. I don't mean it in a supernatural sense, more like the air itself was thicker, harder to breathe, and carried that stench of mildew even stronger. The walls were tagged with graffiti, some of it crude, some of it nonsensical. Broken glass crunched under my shoes, and with every step, I half expected the floor to collapse under me. The third floor was worse. It was more open, almost like an attic, but with big gaps where the walls had fallen apart. The river's light poured in through holes in the roof, catching dust in the air so it looked like smoke swirling around me. I thought maybe I'd find old furniture or maybe some evidence of squatters. What I did find was something I've never been able to shake. The walls were covered, not in graffiti, not in paint. They were covered in pictures, hundreds of them, maybe more. At first, I thought they were family portraits or clippings from magazines, but when I stepped closer, my stomach dropped. They were all of women, not smiling, not posing. These weren't normal pictures. The women were tied up, some gagged, some beaten. Their faces were twisted in pain or fear. The tape holding the photos was old, curling at the corners, but the images themselves were still sharp. For a moment, my brain couldn't process it. I tried to tell myself they were staged photos, but the way some of the women looked, it didn't feel fake. A few of them looked unconscious. A few, well, I couldn't convince myself they were alive. My chest tightened in a way that felt like my body was warning me to get the hell out. The strangest part was the way the room felt after I realized what I was looking at. Before, it had just been an old, broken-down place. But once I saw those pictures, it was like the air changed. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been living up there, surrounded by this sick collage. In the corner, there was a mattress on the floor, covered in stains I didn't want to identify. A few cans of food sat beside it, long expired, rust eating through the labels. A single candle stub was melted onto the floor, with wax dripping down like frozen blood. Whoever stayed here hadn't just been passing through. They had made this their space. I remember standing frozen, trying to listen. The building was quiet, but not silent. There were faint drips of water somewhere, the sound of the river outside, the occasional creak of the old beams. Every little sound felt amplified, like it was sneaking up behind me. And the entire time, I had this sensation that if I turned around too quickly, I'd see someone standing there, watching me. My legs finally caught up with my brain, and I decided I needed to leave. As I backed toward the stairs, I kept my eyes on the walls, almost afraid to turn my back on them. The faces in those pictures seemed to follow me. It wasn't paranoia. They really did seem alive, like their eyes were locked onto mine. By the time I reached the top of the stairs, I could feel my heart pounding so loud it seemed to echo through the whole place. Going back down was worse than climbing up. Every groan of the wood made me imagine it giving out beneath me, trapping me in that nightmare room. When I finally dropped out of the opening, I'd climbed through and landed on the dirt outside. It felt like my lungs could finally work again. I didn't run though, I wanted to. Every part of me screamed to take off as fast as I could. But something about that place made me feel like running would draw attention. Like if I moved too quickly, whatever energy lingered there would chase me. So I walked, steady and calm, all the way back to the main road. That night I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, those images burned into my mind. The tied hands, the gags, the lifeless expressions. I told myself they had to be from magazines, staged to look brutal. But the truth is, I'll never know. The idea that someone had chosen to cover their walls with them, to live surrounded by those faces, was enough to make it real to me. I never went back to that building. In fact, I avoided the entire area for years afterward. I told a couple of friends about what I'd seen, but I don't think they believed me. They said I probably just freaked myself out. But the look in those women's eyes wasn't staged. You can't fake fear like that. Even now when I think about it, I get the same chill I felt standing in that room. The worst part isn't even the pictures themselves. It's the thought that whoever put them there might have been sitting on that filthy mattress, staring at them the same way I had. And maybe, just maybe, they were still close by when I stumbled across their shrine. I'll never know for sure, and maybe that's the part that keeps me awake sometimes. Maybe the building was just a leftover shell with old garbage in it. Or maybe I stepped into something much darker, something that didn't want me there. All I know is I never looked at abandoned places the same way again. Story 6. There's something about the Australian bush at night that eats your senses without even touching you. When the sun goes down, it's not just dark, it's thick. The kind of darkness that feels like it's pressing against your skin. You hear things moving that don't exist, or at least you hope they don't exist. The air smells damp and earthy, a mixture of fallen leaves, mud, and whatever the forest decides to give off at night. I had been 19 when this happened, leading a column of cadets along a trail toward our campsite. It was late, around 10 or 11, and the night was unusually still. Most of the cadets weren't allowed to carry torches. Only me in front and another flight commander at the back had lights, to preserve night vision for everyone else and to prevent our group from being too visible to passing vehicles. That night, everything about the forest felt amplified, every shadow longer, every sound sharper. As we walked, I kept catching tiny flashes on the forest floor. From a distance, I thought it was dew glinting like little blue diamonds. At first, I ignored it. I had to keep my position in the formation and couldn't stop to inspect anything properly. Still, my curiosity gnawed at me. The flashes weren't random. They moved as we did, keeping pace with our column, just at the edges of the trail. I tried convincing myself they were just reflections from scattered leaves or insects, but my gut told me otherwise. The closer we got to the break point, the more persistent those little sparks of light became. Eventually, we stopped briefly for a break, and I used the chance to take a closer look. I slipped off to the side of the trail, crouching down and shining my head torch on the nearest cluster of diamonds. That's when the illusion shattered. It wasn't dew or anything harmless. There were 5 of them at first, crouched in the leaf litter, each one huge with long legs splayed and bodies almost as big as my hand. They stared at me, completely motionless except for the faint twitching of legs. My first thought was paralysis, the kind that traps you between disbelief and fear. As my torch beam moved across the ground, I realized I wasn't seeing just a small patch of spiders. The whole forest floor seemed alive. Thousands of them, their dark shapes scattered across the undergrowth, some climbing tree trunks, others perched in the branches, all glaring at me with an unblinking intensity that made my chest tighten. I'm not exaggerating when I say I am terrified of spiders. Always have been. I froze, my mouth dry, heart hammering like it was trying to escape my ribcage. The forest had become something else entirely, a place that had been quietly watching us without revealing its true form. Every leaf that rustled, every branch that creaked, felt like it was part of some slow, deliberate motion, guiding my panic. My mind screamed at me to run, but I couldn't leave the cadets behind. I had to get back to the formation without making it obvious that I was about to lose my mind. I tried to move calmly, forcing my legs to take steps that didn't look like I was panicking. Every sound, my boots crunching on leaves, my head torch swinging slightly, seemed amplified, alerting whatever it was that the forest had been hiding. I caught glimpses of hundreds more spiders as I walked back, and my stomach churned with the certainty that they were following somehow, aware of my presence. At one point, I swore I saw a group higher up in the trees, their long legs extending toward me, casting grotesque shadows on the forest floor. I blinked and they were gone, leaving only the sensation of movement around me. When I rejoined the column, I had to act normal. The other cadets were tired, a few rubbing their eyes, and the second flight commander at the rear didn't notice anything out of the ordinary. I told myself to focus on the path, on the rhythm of steps, anything to ground myself in reality. But my mind wouldn't stop replaying the image of those spiders, the way they didn't scatter, the way they seemed to observe me individually. I couldn't shake the idea that they were intelligent in some way, that somehow the forest had chosen to reveal itself to me alone, and that I had violated a boundary just by looking too closely. That week at the campsite, I could feel it everywhere I went. Every rustle of leaves, every branch snapping in the distance made me tense. I refused to step off the cleared paths at night, even for water or to relieve myself. I kept my head torch on longer than necessary, scanning the shadows as though the light could protect me from the millions of eyes hidden in the darkness. At night, every whispered sound, every soft scuffle of something moving in the underbrush, made me jump, convinced I would see them emerge from the leaf litter or drop from the branches above. During the day, the forest seemed normal, almost peaceful, but the memory of that night hung over me like a physical weight. I found myself avoiding that particular trail, imagining the patterns of movement beneath the leaves, the thousands of dark shapes poised in stillness. The thought of going back, of stepping into that section of bush again, made my skin crawl in a way I hadn't experienced before. I've tried rational explanations. Maybe it was a massive aggregation of huntsman spiders, something known to occur in the Australian bush. Maybe my fear made me overestimate their numbers. Maybe the light from the torch caused reflections that magnified their presence. But it doesn't matter. Even if there's a scientific reason, the feeling of being watched, the sheer scale of what I saw, the way the light hit them and revealed their still, crouching bodies. That will stick with me forever. I don't know if I'll ever return to that bush. The camp ended, the cadets went home, but that one section of trail, the diamonds on the forest floor, the countless eyes staring up at me, stays alive in my mind. I sometimes wake up and think I see movement at the edge of my room, the shadows forming into shapes that are too long, too many, too aware. And even now, years later, whenever I hear the faintest rustle of leaves at night, my heart races the way it did the first time. And I remember that I walked through a forest that wasn't quite empty, a place where millions of tiny predators seemed to notice me, study me, and wait. Story 7. Some nights just feel off, like the air itself is heavier than it should be, carrying a quiet tension that makes every shadow look like it's moving. Back in 2008, I decided to go on one of those last-minute Halloween adventures, trying to find a local haunted house just for the thrill. I remember sitting at my computer, searching late into the night, before finally finding directions to a place about 45 minutes out of Auburn, Alabama. It wasn't some big attraction, just a local deal, probably someone's old property converted into a haunted experience for the season. I figured it would be fun, a small adventure to break the monotony of the weekend. I left around 10 at night, driving through quiet neighborhoods at first, then following the directions down increasingly rural roads. The streetlights disappeared, replaced by long stretches of darkness, the kind where headlights barely cut through the black, and your eyes start imagining shapes in the trees. Eventually, I turned down a dirt road that snaked into the woods, the gravel crunching under my tires. By then, the night was completely silent except for the car. No animals, no other cars, no lights anywhere. It felt like I had crossed into a different world, one isolated and removed from civilization. Every turn seemed longer than the last, and the forest on either side leaned in, dense and shadowed, pressing the darkness closer to the road. After about 10 minutes of careful driving, I finally saw it. A house sitting back from the road, barely visible except for the faint glow of a single lamp. By the driveway was a sign, handwritten, saying simply, "Haunted House." There were no other cars, no sounds, nothing that suggested anyone else was there. I sat in the car for a moment, gripping the steering wheel, realizing just how quiet and isolated it was. Part of me told myself this was all just the thrill of Halloween and my imagination getting carried away. But another part of me shivered, noticing how completely alone I was. I debated whether to leave, the idea whispering in my mind that maybe this wasn't worth it, but curiosity pushed me forward. I started to pull into the driveway slowly, trying to make as little noise as possible. That's when it happened. 15 feet ahead of me, almost like it had appeared out of nowhere, an old pickup truck turned on, headlights blazing right into my face. My heart jumped, and I slammed on the brakes instinctively. The truck's engine roared, and it started moving toward me down the driveway. Lights aimed straight at the car like they were hunting me. I panicked, quickly reversing and trying to back out of the driveway, the truck inching closer with every move. The combination of pitch-black woods, a deserted road, and bright lights in my eyes made it feel like a scene from a horror movie. I floored it, tires spinning on the gravel, trying to get far enough away to turn safely, but the truck stayed on my tail, following me, almost bumping my rear bumper. The beams cut through the darkness relentlessly, and I was hyper-aware of every curve in the dirt road, every tree that seemed to reach for the car. My mind raced, picturing every worst-case scenario. What if it was someone dangerous waiting to see who would stop at that house? What if it was meant to trap me there? I didn't know. I just knew I had to get out. The road seemed to stretch forever, the kind of long, rural path where there's no escape except to keep driving straight. Every turn was tense, every rustle in the forest nearby making me flinch. The truck stayed on my tail the whole way, lights glaring, engine growling behind me. I considered stopping, but that would have been suicide. I kept thinking about those horror movies where the car comes to a dead stop and the driver faces the monster, or a person, waiting in the dark. My pulse was hammering and I could barely focus on the road ahead. It wasn't until I finally reached an exit leading back toward the main highway that the truck let up. It slowed, stayed in the woods for a moment like it was waiting, then turned off, disappearing into the shadows. I didn't look back. I didn't slow down. The rest of the drive home was a blur, my hands still gripping the wheel like I wouldn't be able to let go. Even after turning onto familiar roads, I felt like something was still out there, tracking me, watching to see what I would do next. I replayed it in my head for days afterward, thinking about what might have happened if I had gotten out of the car at that driveway. If I had stepped out to explore, maybe to take a picture of the house, or just to prove to myself it was real, would the truck have been waiting closer? Would it have made a move? I'll never know. That part of it, the unknown, was what really got under my skin. Even now, years later, I think back to the isolation, the pitch-black trees pressing in on that dirt road, the handwritten sign, and the truck that followed me, almost bumping the car the entire way home. There's a part of me that wants to rationalize it. Maybe it was someone playing a prank, someone who knew the house and the roads and thought it would be funny to scare a lone visitor. But another part of me, the part that remembers how helpless and exposed I felt in those woods, refuses to let me shrug it off entirely. The thing about experiences like that is that they stick. They linger in your mind, changing the way you look at quiet country roads and isolated houses. I still remember the smell of the dirt, the way the headlights reflected off the trees, the deep silence punctuated by that truck's engine growl. It's not just fear, it's the sense that the world suddenly became bigger and darker than you realized, and that for one night, you were completely at the mercy of forces you couldn't see or understand. I've never gone back, and I don't plan to. Even decades later, I think about what could have happened if I hadn't been fast enough, if the truck had decided to stop me. That night in Auburn, Alabama, is the only time I've ever been so sure that something felt off beyond explanation, that the woods themselves seemed to hold a presence that didn't belong to the world of ordinary people. Story 8. I've always liked taking my dog for long walks in the woods behind my house. It's the kind of place where the city feels miles away, even though it's only a few blocks from the edge of town. She loves sniffing every tree, digging through leaves, and finding sticks and small bones along the trails. Most of the time, it's just the two of us, and the woods are quiet, peaceful, the way they should be. But one afternoon, something happened that made me question every walk I'd ever taken there. It started like any other day. The air was crisp, the sun low, filtering through the canopy in thin golden streaks. My dog wandered ahead, nose down, sniffing something under the trees. She came back with a small deer bone in her mouth, which didn't surprise me. She had a habit of finding the odd thing out here. I dropped it in the grass, thinking nothing of it, and continued along the path, enjoying the sound of leaves crunching under my boots and the occasional crow cawing in the distance. Then, almost out of nowhere, she bolted. I mean ran full speed, ears back, growling low in that way she does when something excites or alarms her. She skidded to a stop near a large black bag tucked under some low branches and began pawing and barking at it like her life depended on it. My heart started to race. It was the kind of alert that makes every hair on your arm stand up. Curiosity and dread hit me at the same time. I approached slowly, keeping my distance, half expecting her to run off at the last second. I opened the bag, and what I saw made me stop cold. Bones, human-sized bones, stacked in a chaotic jumble inside the bag. My stomach flipped. I dropped the bag shut with my foot, feeling like I might throw up. I stared at the forest around me, trying to convince myself that I was overreacting. Maybe it was animal remains from hunters, I thought. Maybe someone had buried old animal bones and dug them back up. That explanation barely worked, but it was the first thing that came to mind. Shaking, I decided to keep walking. Trying to rationalize it, I told myself not to panic. But then I noticed more black bags, tucked behind trees, leaning against stumps, hidden along the trail. 1, 2, 3, and then a cluster of them, at least 20, all filled with bones. Some were large, some smaller, and they were stacked so neatly it almost felt intentional. The sheer number of them made my skin crawl. I could almost feel eyes on me, though I knew no one was there. The wind rustled through the trees in a way that sounded almost like whispering, and the forest suddenly felt alive with quiet, observing intent. I checked the path behind me, my dog still circling the nearest bag, growling softly. The rational part of me kept trying to make sense of it. Hunters? A medical school dumping old specimens? But the more I looked, the less sense it made. They weren't scattered randomly. They were arranged, some standing upright, some leaning together like they were being displayed. Whoever or whatever had done this wanted it to be noticed, and I didn't want to be noticed. My heart was pounding as I backed away slowly, eyes scanning every shadow, every branch, trying to spot movement. Nothing. Just me, my dog, the bags, and the silent forest. The air felt thicker here, like it was pressing down with every step I took. Every time my dog growled or sniffed at one of the bags, I flinched, imagining something springing out from the trees, someone waiting to see what I would do next. I told myself to leave, but I couldn't stop glancing at the bags. The first one had been weird enough, but seeing 20 or more lined up like that made my stomach churn. The forest seemed darker than before, the shadows stretching longer, and the sun was dipping low enough that the light barely reached the trail. I felt an urge to run, but I didn't want to startle my dog. Every instinct screamed that we needed to leave immediately. I started retracing my steps, keeping my eyes down the path and watching for movement in the woods. Every rustle in the underbrush made me jump. My mind raced, imagining every possible scenario. A serial killer using this place to hide evidence. Someone watching from the trees, maybe even something worse that couldn't be explained. The rational explanations were fraying under the weight of what I had seen. Halfway back, I noticed the forest had gone completely quiet. No birds, no wind, no animals. Just silence, heavy and thick. My dog stayed close to me, tail tucked low, muscles tense. I gripped her leash tightly, feeling the tremor in my hands. Every step felt slower, like the ground itself was resisting me leaving. I could still see the bags ahead in the distance, black shapes against the brown and green of the woods, and each one seemed to pulse with some unspoken intent. By the time I finally reached the edge of the woods near the road, I was sweating and shaking. My dog was panting hard, still alert, refusing to fully relax. I didn't look back. I didn't stop until I reached the safety of the streetlights and the few houses nearby. Even then, I kept checking over my shoulder. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the bags, the neat rows of bones, and how deliberately placed they were. I went over every rational explanation. Hunters, animal remains, medical students' discarded specimens, pranksters. None of it fit the scene I had seen. The idea that someone had been there, watching, arranging the bones for a reason I couldn't understand, kept me awake. The next day, I returned to the edge of the woods cautiously, but the trail was empty, no bags, nothing to indicate that any of it had been there at all. My dog didn't even pause at the spot where she had gone nuts the day before. It was as if the forest had swallowed everything I'd seen overnight. I considered asking neighbors if anyone had noticed anything, but the thought of having to describe 20 black bags full of bones to strangers felt too heavy, too unbelievable. Even now, years later, the image stays with me. The way the bags seemed to multiply the deeper I went into the woods, the sense of being watched, the quiet that fell over the trees. I don't walk that trail anymore. I tell myself it was hunters or some strange disposal site, but a part of me knows that whatever I saw that day wasn't meant to be explained. And sometimes when I think about it late at night, I imagine those bags still out there, waiting, perfectly lined up, filled with secrets the woods would never share with anyone brave or foolish enough to wander in. Story 9. I've always liked wandering through the woods alone. There's something about being surrounded by trees, hearing your footsteps crunch over fallen leaves, and feeling completely cut off from the rest of the world that's both calming and unsettling at the same time. One summer when I was about 11, I decided to follow a friend who said he had something important to show me. At first, it seemed like a normal hike. We walked down a worn dirt path for a solid 20 minutes, the sun filtering through the branches, the birds calling overhead. I remember thinking how quiet everything seemed for mid-morning, like the forest itself was holding its breath. Eventually, my friend veered off the path, ducking into a stand of thin, closely planted trees. I hesitated for a second, unsure if I should follow, but curiosity won over. The trees were so close together that I had to squeeze through them, twisting my arms to avoid scraping my skin on the bark. I kept asking myself why he wanted to go this far off the path, but he didn't answer. He just kept moving forward until he stopped abruptly. When I emerged into the clearing, my breath caught in my throat. In front of me was a small, round mud hut. The structure was low, the kind you could almost step into without bending, and it looked like it had been built by hand with a lot of care. There was a little fire pit in the center of the floor, surrounded by roughly constructed wooden benches that someone had made themselves. I noticed immediately that the floor of the hut was lower than the ground outside, like it had been dug into the earth. The shadows inside flickered from the fire pit, giving the room a strange, almost otherworldly glow. The thing that really stopped me, though, was the walls. Every inch of the mud walls was covered with animal skulls. Some were tiny, like the skulls of sparrows or small rodents. Others were much larger, deer skulls mostly, and they were all attached by wires so that they hovered just above the wall. It was meticulous, organized, and utterly creepy. I couldn't decide whether it was impressive or horrifying. The skulls stared at me from all angles, their empty eye sockets seeming to follow me wherever I moved. I wanted to turn around immediately and leave, but there was something about the way the room felt that held me there. My friend was standing at the edge of the clearing, too scared to step inside, which made me feel like I had no choice but to explore it. I stepped in cautiously, trying not to touch anything. The smell of the earth mixed with smoke from the fire pit made the air heavy. The flickering shadows created shapes on the walls that weren't really there. Or maybe they were. Every time I moved, it felt like a skull shifted slightly, as if observing me. Outside the hut, there was a small wooden bench with the phrase, "Where heaven and earth meet," carved into it. I noticed it as I hesitated near the doorway. The words were simple, but in the middle of the forest, surrounded by all those skulls, they felt like a warning. A shiver ran down my spine, and for the first time since entering, I considered turning back. The fire pit in the center of the hut seemed to pulse as I stood there. I couldn't see anyone else around, but the shadows gave me the distinct sense that I wasn't entirely alone. My instincts were screaming at me to leave, but something about the arrangement of the benches, the careful placement of the skulls, and the words outside made me feel like I was supposed to notice something, like the hut itself was trying to communicate. The longer I stayed, the more I noticed the small details. The way the wires holding the skulls had twisted into patterns, the faint soot marks on the ceiling from smoke, the smell of damp earth and charred wood mixing in the air. At one point, I thought I heard a whisper, but when I froze and listened, there was nothing. The forest outside was quiet, still holding its breath. I convinced myself it was just my imagination. I had been walking for a while, my heart racing from squeezing through the trees in the heat of the day, and the nervous energy was probably manifesting in sounds that weren't real. Even so, every time I glanced at the skulls, I felt eyes on me. Their hollow sockets seemed to track my movement, and I couldn't stop glancing at the small ones near the floor, imagining tiny jaws snapping at my feet. The larger deer skulls above me seemed to loom over the space like sentinels, keeping watch. The more I looked, the less I wanted to touch anything. My hand itched to check the wires to see how they were suspended, but I didn't dare. I stepped closer to the fire pit, which hadn't been lit in years, I was pretty sure. The ashes were cold, but the pit itself was meticulously arranged with small stones that formed a perfect circle. I noticed faint scorch marks along the benches, as though someone had built small fires there before. The smell of smoke, combined with the smell of damp mud, made my stomach twist. I wanted to leave, but my curiosity wouldn't let me turn my back on the hut. I moved slowly, taking in the carvings in the wood of the benches, the small notches in the floorboards, and the deliberate way the skulls had been placed. It felt ceremonial. Every inch of the hut seemed intentional, like the space had been built to be exact. I couldn't imagine how long it had taken someone to arrange everything just so, and that thought made me shiver. Finally, I decided to leave. My friend was still outside, nervously pacing. As I stepped toward the doorway, I couldn't shake the feeling that the hut itself was watching me leave. The shadows seemed to stretch longer, reaching toward me. The skulls caught the light differently as I moved, almost as if they were reacting. I stepped outside, felt the sun on my face, and immediately felt the tension in my shoulders ease. We walked back through the narrow trees in silence. I didn't say anything, and my friend didn't either. Later, when I thought about it, I realized I hadn't heard a single animal or bird while inside the clearing, which was unusual for a forest in the middle of summer. The place had been completely sealed off from the outside world, and it felt like stepping back into normality took every ounce of concentration. Even years later, I remember that hut vividly. I've gone back to forests since then, wandered off paths and explored hidden areas, but nothing has ever felt quite as purposeful. The skulls, the fire pit, the carvings, they weren't just decorations or oddities. They felt like a message I couldn't interpret, a warning from whoever had made that place. Whether it was a ritual, a shrine, or just a strange project, I'll never know. All I know is that walking into that hut, seeing the skulls, feeling the heavy silence, and stepping back out into the sun is one of the creepiest experiences I've ever had. I still think about it when I'm alone in the woods, and part of me wonders if I'll ever stumble across something like that again. Some place that feels alive in ways that aren't easy to explain. Story 10. Growing up in the woods feels like living in a world that's half alive and half made up. My house was tiny, built on what used to be an old stable property. My room was right where the hay used to be stacked, so even when the building was modernized, the smell of dried grass would sometimes sneak through the floorboards. It was subtle, a faint aroma that would drift in at random, and it always felt like the house was remembering its old life. I never could figure out if that smell was real or my imagination, but it wasn't the smell that scared me most. It was everything else that made the air feel thick with tension. The dog I had as a kid never liked my room. It would refuse to go upstairs, growling or backing away whenever I tried to lead it up there. Even when I went alone, I could feel the unease in the air, the kind that makes your skin crawl, makes every creak in the floor sound sharper than it should. And there were the noises, knocking on doors that weren't even being touched. My house had 3 entrances, all doors that led outside, and sometimes they would all get tapped at once. I would run to check, heart pounding, and find nothing. No wind, no animal, no one. Just the echo of knocks that shouldn't exist. The clearing outside my window was another strange element. My room had a massive window that overlooked the garden, which opened into a small patch of woods. From up there, you could see the trees stretch in all directions, and during the day, it felt peaceful. At night, though, the woods looked like something had settled inside them, something patient, watching. I spent a lot of time staring out there, telling myself the shadows were just the trees, the branches swaying with the wind. But sometimes the shapes in the dark would move in ways that didn't make sense, quick flashes that couldn't be explained by squirrels or deer. One night, when I was about 10 or 11, I was sitting in my room late, reading, when I first noticed something wasn't right. It started small, a faint giggle, like a child playing somewhere far away. I paused, thinking it might be coming from the woods, or maybe a neighbor's house. But the sound was different. It had a hollow, distant quality, and it came from upstairs. That's when I remembered. I was already upstairs. The noise was inside the house, and it sounded like it was coming from my room. I froze, listening, heart hammering. The giggle repeated, soft and high-pitched, echoing off the walls like it had nowhere to go but linger. I jumped up and ran to the window, thinking maybe it was a neighbor's kid who had wandered too close, but the garden was empty. Nothing moved except the trees in the breeze, and even the breeze didn't sound like laughter. I scanned the clearing, straining to see any figure, any movement. And then I saw it, a small, dark shape darting between the trees, moving impossibly fast, slipping between shadows. My stomach dropped. Whatever it was running away from the house, but it felt like it had been looking right at me. For the next 2 years, living in that house was impossible to shake off. The dog's refusal to go upstairs never changed. I never stayed in my room for long without feeling watched. Sometimes the smell of hay would drift in, and I would swear someone had been standing in the corner of the room, brushing past the old bales that no longer existed. The knocking on the doors continued, especially at night, and I became hyper-aware of every sound. Footsteps in the hall, the scrape of branches against the window, the faint giggle that seemed to come from nowhere but everywhere at once. It wasn't just the noises that unnerved me. The atmosphere of the house felt different from any other place I had ever been. The air upstairs felt heavier, like it had been compressed with something I couldn't see. Shadows lingered where they shouldn't, moving slower than the light. My own reflection in the mirror sometimes seemed to pause a fraction too long, like it had its own awareness. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was my imagination. Maybe I was just a kid wired to notice oddities, but rational explanations started feeling thin, like paper walls. The night of the giggle changed everything. I was sitting at my desk, reading by a small lamp, when the sound started again. Soft, high-pitched, playful, and unmistakably close. I got up and approached the window to see the garden and the clearing beyond. The wind was still, the trees didn't move, and everything outside looked calm. And yet the giggle came again, this time clearly inside the house. I turned around slowly, heart racing, and for a split second, I thought I saw someone in the corner of my room. A small figure, just a shadow standing by the far wall watching. Before I could blink, it was gone, and I could feel the window behind me shift as if someone had brushed past it. I ran to the window and saw the dark figure sprinting into the woods. Not walking, not running slowly, but sprinting in a way that made my stomach knot. It wasn't human, or at least not in the way I understood human movement. The figure disappeared into the darkness, leaving nothing behind. The giggle echoed once more, fading into the trees. I didn't sleep that night, and I kept the lights on until the sun rose. After that, every visit to that room was a challenge. I tried to convince myself it was a neighbor's kid, or maybe a trick of wind and sound. But the smell of hay, the dog's constant refusal, the random knocks, and that fleeting shadow made everything feel too intentional. I didn't feel alone in the house. Even during the day, the air upstairs felt heavier, like the walls had absorbed something that didn't belong. Every time I looked out the window at the clearing, I half expected to see that small, dark figure waiting for me again. By the time I moved out of that house, I had spent years living with the constant sense of being watched, hearing the giggles, smelling the hay, and dodging unseen presences. I've never lived anywhere quite like it since. I've told people about it over the years, and some laugh it off as a kid's imagination. Some say old houses have quirks. But I know what I experienced. I know the window, the clearing, the giggle, and the figure that darted into the woods are burned into my memory. Even now, when I close my eyes at night, I can see that window, that clearing, and I swear I hear the faintest giggle from the shadows. And sometimes, just sometimes, I wonder if it's still there, waiting in the trees, watching the place I once called home.